Hello chess friends and welcome to Zad of Chess channel and welcome to the Skilling Open in 2020. We're again in the semi-final stage. We're analyzing now the second match game between Magnus Carlsen against Jan Nepomniachtchi. In the first game, match game yesterday, Magnus Carlsen took the lead. Now it was really time for Nepo to do something, and he started the second day with a great win against Magnus Carlsen. He checkmated him in the first game. Now in the second game, Magnus Carlsen had to do something if he doesn't want to risk his result. Of course, if Nepo wins now today the second match game, then they have to play additional games and maybe even the Armageddon game. So let's check out now the game, and then of course I'm going to reveal you the results of the second match game, but also I will reveal you the result of this other match game between Hikaru Nakamura and Wesley So. So here Magnus played his second game, as I said, with the white pieces. He opened with move e4, Nepo plays c5, the Sicilian. We have c3, the Alpine variation against the Sicilian, which is again popular, I think. Many top grandmasters are playing it again. We have knight to f6, e5, we have knight to d5, still common theory, and now knight to f3. Here in the game, knight to c6 was played, and now bishop to c4, still the main line of these types of setups. Here, knight to b6 and bishop to b3. Okay, let's stop and evaluate a little bit the position. The problem for black is, of course, this advanced pawn, which is supported by the knight. It creates, of course, a very important space advantage. On the other hand, I think white has here some problems on the queen side, because black can also push the pawn on c4, and we have also troubles with this backward pawn on the d file. So that's why here Nepo plays the move d5 immediately. So there are now several choices. You can go maybe even d4 here, but it's very risky. It's not such a good idea here for white if white does it. I think c takes d4 can happen. This wasn't played in the game, but I wanted to show one particular line, c takes d4, and now bishop to f5. I think from this point on, black has really a comfortable game. Will play e6, has now opportunities to play something like knight to b4, knight to d3. This knight is very active. The knight can be cemented on this very active square c4. So that's why rushing into this attacks is not so good. So that's why the main line is here e takes d6. And now queen to d6. If you, for instance, play e takes d6, then we simply castle, play rook to e1. Black will still have troubles to develop here the dark square bishop, and then maybe again we can create this d4 pawn breakthrough idea. So in the game after e takes d6, we have queen to d6, and now Magnus simply castles. We have bishop to e6. There is also this line c4 can be played, but now we can play maybe bishop to c2. Now after bishop to g4, which is I think the most aggressive way, black threatens here a very complex game after castling and creating pressure against the backward pawn. The main problem in white setup in this Alpine variation is this backward pawn on d2, but now rook to e1 can be played, maybe knight to e5, the pinning idea. Now rook to e5, bishop to f3, and now queen to e1. After the bishop retreats, we can, I think, try b3, finally get rid of this very annoying pawn on c4. But this wasn't played in the game, but there are really many lines. I wanted to show you the main ideas, how you should maybe counterplay this idea by black to move c4. We can play in some occasions even d3 if we have, for instance, a good protection with bishop to c2. Then maybe d4 can be played. That's our main goal, to really advance the backward pawn here. Or this position can be broken also with the move b3. This is a very annoying pawn. Now black does basically the same which we have done in the beginning, this advanced pawn on e5. Now black is the advanced pawn on c4, so that's why I think this pawn has to be broken immediately. But Jan Nepo plays here a very interesting line, bishop to e6. It has been played also many times in chess history. We have bishop to e6, queen to e6, and now a4 by Magnus Carlsen. And in this particular line, Magnus Carlsen in 2008 lost one game. He was only 18 years old, but still, this is a very aggressive line immediately. Whenever you see that the knights are maybe vulnerable to some pawn attacks, do it. Sometimes create at least some kind of a space advantage after a potential a5 move. We can also play maybe rook lift here, rook to a4, and then use the fourth rank in order to attack here some other files on the board. So in the game, queen to d7 was played. This is a very important move, because if you play something like d4 immediately, you see, then you risk after c takes d4, maybe knight to d4, knight to d4, and c takes d4, you risk an isolated pawn situation. And I think, again, from this point on, black has a comfortable game with knight to d5, fixing the position here with e6, play bishop to d6, and then castling is perfectly fine here. I think white will have problems around this isolated pawn, so that's why you shouldn't do it. Here Magnus Carlsen found, I think, a great way how to escape from this idea. He plays the move a5. Okay, what to do here? There is, of course, the line maybe knight to c8, but now we could play probably d4 because black has some developing problems with this knight. But here Nepo plays knight to d5, and we can play now a6, b6, and now d4. After c takes d4, we have knight to d4, and you see if black takes now knight takes d4, queen to d4, we don't risk anymore this isolated pawn situation on the d file. We have a centralized queen. This bishop has still a good activity. We can play with our knight here on a3, maybe c2, even e3, or maybe even immediately knight to d2, knight to c4, knight to e4. So I think in this particular line, white has a good activity. White doesn't have weakened pawn structures. This pawn is perfectly fine, and these pawns are firm here on b2 and c3. So that's why here after the move knight to d4, Nepo goes into normal development with e6, and Magnus takes. Knight takes c6, queen to c6, and now queen to g4. Very important move, which blocks a little bit black's further progress. Black would love, of course, to play with the bishop, then castle somehow. That's why here h5, played by Jan Nepomniachtchi, and we have queen to e2. We have b5, very, very nice positional idea. What, of course, Nepo realized here that he has now a powerful centralized knight, and he doesn't want to leave this square. This is a very important centralized square. The knight is perfectly fine here, of course, in the center of the board. So that's why he's supporting it further, because in some occasions this knight could be kicked away with the potential c4 move. So very, very interesting idea. This position hasn't been played in chess history so far. Very interesting line. Black, I think, has here a solid game. It's not a problem in the game. I think Nepo didn't make inaccuracies or mistakes so far in the opening. In the game, Magnus played knight to a3, and we have here bishop to a3, rook to a3, and here Nepo relies really simply on his very powerful centralized knight. He wants to create further the blockade. In the game, f6 was played. Here Nepo doesn't want to even castle. He wants to secure the king with the square move, with the king move here on the square f7. So rook to b3, attacking the pawn. We have knight to c7, rook to b4, and now queen takes a6, played by Nepo, which was maybe a slight inaccuracy, maybe something like here simply again retreating after rook to b3, knight to c6, here rook to b4. Maybe we can fix the pawn structure with e5, but I think king to f7 is also perfectly fine here. The king cannot be attacked further. We can then use this rook in order to defend. Still, I think this bishop is not so powerful. We can play maybe bishop to f4, but again, it can be met with knight to d5. So, but Nepo goes for the pawn, and Magnus plays now rook to h4. A better idea is simply to play here rook to d4. That's slightly better because we're controlling now the d7. We can double up rooks on the d file, although we're one pawn down. But I think now the knight and the queen are a little bit too overloaded to the defense of the b5, so it was sort of a poison pawn. Black could maybe compete on the d file, but we can trade off. And here again we can occupy this file, get the queen somehow here on d3. Now finally the bishop can play maybe e3, bishop to f4, creating this very important battery on the d file. I think black could have some troubles in this particular line. So, but here Magnus goes rook to h4, which wasn't really the best of moves. Here king to f7, now finally rook to h5. Okay, we have now our pawn back, but now after knight to d5, again Nepo goes for this cementing line. He wants again to have his very powerful knight on d5, because now the b5 is not a weakness anymore. It cannot be attacked anymore by the rook, or at least it can be attacked maybe, but you lose simply too much tempos. In the game, rook to e1, we have queen to c6, and now h4. We have now a5. Very interesting idea by Nepo. He realized that maybe he can create here a pass pawn situation on the a file. Perfectly fine. The pawn structure is not messed up. In the game, rook to h8, rook takes h8, and now h5. What Magnus wants to do is finally to attack and split the pawn structure in front of the king. He wants at least to deflect this pawn from the defense of the f6. Now to get the queen on h5, maybe create another rook lift, really include all of his pieces in the attack. But it's risky. Whenever you leave also your protection of the king, it can be also dangerous for your king. The evaluation is equal for both sides, but as I said, it's still a complex endgame here. Both players have chances, as I said, and Magnus goes now into a very risky line. He wants simply to create further weaknesses. We have a4, bishop to d2, and knight to e7, and now comes this idea, h6, g takes h6, and now queen to h5. Okay, Magnus can grab his pawn back, but the problem is, of course, that the queen is now pinned here. The queen is stuck a little bit to the defense of the bishop on h6. In the game, queen to d8, d6 was played, rook to d1, and now queen to c6. Here, Magnus goes very aggressively now, rook to d4, with ideas, of course, to play rook to g4. In the game, we have f5, which was now really a mistake by Nepo. Maybe even e5. Here is slightly better. We're kicking away the rook to g4, and maybe now rook to g8 can be played. Queen to f5 maybe here by white could be played, but now queen to e6 I think protects everything. This is a good position, a solid position. Still, what we can notice, even if white trades off maybe here the queens on e6, the most important thing is that our pawns here are on light squares. They cannot be attacked by the bishop. That's the most important thing, and I think this could be playable here for black. We can again maybe remaneuver our rook here to the a file or the b file, even maybe even try some b4 ideas if this rook, for instance, leaves somewhere. So, but Nepo plays really a necessary move. After the move rook to d4, he plays f5, and this weakens simply the pawn structure, the dark squares here in front of the king too much. We have a dark square bishop, and Magnus simply now attacks the dark square weaknesses. He plays first rook to d3, we have rook to g8, bishop to g5, rook to h8, and now queen to e2. We have queen to c8, and now rook to h3. Of course, there was this threat around the square h2, so that's why Magnus goes into simplification. We have rook to h3, g takes h3, but now these dark square problems are really something that always black has to take care of. In the game, queen to d6, queen to e5 was played. Magnus is of course not interested in trading off the queens. He realized that he has maybe a slightly better activity. What Nepo wants, of course, to do, if he trades off the queens, then he has a more healthy pawn structure here. Then maybe he could create here a pass pawn on the e file, maybe try to attack somehow here the weak backward pawn on b2. The bishop would be always then a little bit stuck to the defense of the b2 pawn with bishop to c1. You cannot advance the pawns because black has made progress here already on the queen side. So, as I said, black wants to trade off the queens, white doesn't want to trade off the queens because white relies simply here on the dark square problems that Nepo has here, of course. So knight to f8, we have h4 fixing the bishop, so the bishop can stay here. Now we can play much freer with our queen. In the game, king to g6 was played, queen to d8, and now queen to g7. This was again a mistake by Nepo. Maybe king to f7 is slightly better, and king to f1 has to be played if you don't want to risk some perpetuals. Maybe queen to h2, but now at least we can create a check and get our bishop here. So again, no perpetuals would be possible. Maybe queen to b1 can be played, but now we are always threatening here the checkmate. So it's, I think, a perpetual draw if black, for instance, plays like this. But okay, in the game, queen to d8 was played, and now Nepo goes simply behind. He didn't play an active move with the queen somewhere here, attacking the king, at least trying at least some kind of a perpetual check. In the game, Magnus now creates this very dangerous check. Queen to e8, we have king to h7, and now Magnus grabs a pawn. So really a pawn grabber. This Magnus Carlsen is now, of course, he is the one that wants to trade off the queens because he's up now one pawn, and this could be a favorable endgame here for Magnus. So in the game, knight to g6, we have queen to a4, and of course now you cannot even take knight takes h4, which was maybe, I think, one of Nepo's tactical ideas, knight take h4, because you cannot take with the bishop. The queen is attacking the king, but now after queen to a4, you see we have a further protection of the h4, and this is now a completely lost endgame here for black. In the game, knight to e5 was played, queen to f4, queen to h8. We have b4, simply pushing our pass pawn. Here, Magnus simply deflects the queen again from the defense of the king. Bishop to f4, we have a check. King to f1, no more checks are possible. Knight to g4, but now again a new check by Magnus. Queen to g6, and now queen to e7. Very nice endgame technique, really attacking the dark squares in front of black's king. We have knight to f6, and now comes h5 in this position. Jan Nepomniachtchi resigned. So whatever you do, knight to h5, we have queen to g5, at least you're losing immediately. If you try, for instance, like king to f7, we can even take and then promote simply to queen, or we can take the knight. It's the same problem here. If you take here with the king, of course, then again, you lose simply the knight. Again, black doesn't have any checks here, and it was time to really resign this game. So, incredible game. Not sure why now this top grandmasters are playing so often this Alapin variation. It is playable. You see, Magnus played, I think, a very interesting line here. And in the end, Nepo managed to only get a draw in the second day, so it means now that Magnus Carlsen, with the win from yesterday, is now in the finals, where he'll meet Wesley So. Wesley So managed to also get a draw in the second match game against Hikaru Nakamura, and with his win yesterday, Wesley So is the one who played Magnus Carlsen for this very, very nice tournament. So, okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. Really weird one. You see how Magnus plays this endgame. Is really great endgame techniques. He can really calculate everything. He is now deserved in the final. We'll see what will happen against Wesley So. Wesley So really in top shape. Really looking forward to see them playing in the final. So, okay, I hope that you enjoyed this game. I really enjoyed it a lot. If you want to see more games from this tournament, check out my skilling tournament playlist. Here's the link. And if you want to see maybe the best chess games played by engines, check out my commented chess games played by computer. Here's also the link. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.